Welcome. You are about to view a recorded talk of the Progress and Visions in Consciousness Science online seminar series. This series is organised jointly by the Association for Mathematical Consciousness Science, AMCS, the Mediterranean Society for Consciousness Science, and the Oxford Mathematics of Consciousness Network. While every session consists of a talk and discussions, the latter are not recorded and the following will only contain the talk. We hope you will enjoy it. Further information and details on how to join are available on our website.
I'm very happy to be here, and I'll present our work advocating for increasing ecological validity in consciousness science. So this talk is based on a perspective that we wrote. So those who would like to read more about it are welcome to read the manuscript that is linked in the QR code. I will start with some background about common experimental approaches when manipulating consciousness in the lab. Then I'll move on to more of a motivation explaining why ecological validity matters and what advantages it can bring into experimental research. And then I'll present the approach that we suggest for increasing the ecological validity of experiments, specifically in consciousness science. And we'll provide examples from studies already starting to do it in one form or another. And then hopefully I will wrap it up and we can discuss. So a very common practice in the past 30 years or so in consciousness science is to look for the neural correlates of consciousness, those areas and processes that coincide with the conscious experience. And this is following the highly influential works of Francis Crick and Christoph Koch, where they define the neural correlates of consciousness, specifically focusing on vision. And the way that it would look like, if I highly simplify this, is to present the observer with some stimulus such that it is clearly seen and consciously experienced, then manipulate consciousness in some form such that now the observer does not have a conscious experience of it at all. And then, if we record brain activity during these two types of trials, we can compare them and identify the patterns that exist when you are having a conscious experience of that stimulus versus when you're not. And the point here is that, generally speaking, manipulations of visual awareness are a key paradigm in our domain. Of course, this approach is not without criticism. I will not get to it during the talk, though. We can discuss it maybe later, because despite the caveats, this contrasted method of manipulating consciousness of a stimulus and then comparing aware and unaware trials is still pretty much a standard in the field of consciousness research, so we kind of take it as a given. And it has been very popular over the years. So many ways were developed to manipulate consciousness of a stimulus. And a more recent demonstration of this comes from two databases that were developed at Tel Aviv University. One is based on the seminal work of Itai Aron, where he shows the relationship between theories of consciousness and the paradigms used to test them. This is called contrast. And the other is a new database called UnContrast, led by François Stockard and Maor Schreiber, where they examine semantic priming and attentional capture without awareness. And when we look at the methods that of the experiments that exist in those two databases, as an example, we see that many of them, such as masking and stimulus degradation and continuous flat suppression, all of these are indeed manipulations of visual awareness of a specific content. So this is, to this day, an important integral part of the experimental work done in the field. But many of these clever and elegant techniques developed over the years to suppress stimuli from awareness actually don't resemble instances of conscious and unconscious percepts in everyday life outside the lab. So I'll take as an example two of these common paradigms. One of them is masking. In masking experiments, the masked stimulus is presented for a very brief period of time, and also right before it appears and right after it disappears, another pattern flashes, essentially masking the stimulus, suppressing it from awareness. But in everyday life, things are not typically presented like that for tens of milliseconds and isolated with no background and so on. Another example is the method of continuous flash suppression. So in this manipulation, one eye is presented with the target stimulus, and the other one is presented with this dynamic flashing pattern. And what happens is that the percept is of that dynamic pattern such that the target stimulus is essentially suppressed from consciousness. But again, this doesn't mimic anything we're familiar with in non-laboratory settings. In day-to-day life, our eyes don't get completely different inputs. And what we see is way more complex. So generalizing findings from these methods to conclusion about what we can or can't do without consciousness, or about the areas and processes involved when conscious versus when not, is problematic because these practices go so far from the everyday phenomenon that it's unclear what they resonate with outside the lab. And when you step this far, you run the risk of overestimating or underestimating what happens when observers don't consciously see the stimuli. So an overestimation would be generalizing based on findings achieved with such techniques to say something about the way we process without consciousness in everyday life. So studies that find something that we're capable of doing without consciousness under extreme conditions might be pushing it too far. So here, these are just two examples of such findings, one showing that you can process number words without consciousness, the other showing that you can even read full sentences. But note that even if we take these results at face value, the fact that we are able to find cases where unconscious reading is possible doesn't necessarily mean that in everyday life we unconsciously read to a point that it affects our behavior when we walk down the streets or when we drive. So as an example of a maybe bad analogy, just because you can lift a car in a moment of extreme adrenaline doesn't mean that people go and lift cars every day in normal lives, right? So this might be overestimating what happens without consciousness in our daily lives. Another side of the coin is a possible underestimation. So here, it's actually those cases where we fail to find processing of the presented stimuli without awareness, because in everyday life, we don't see things in isolation, right? We see them in context. We can rely on things like prior knowledge when we process information. We see real objects and not 2D images of them on the screen with no background. We use all of our senses and not restricted just to vision. So overall, in addition to the possible overestimation that we might do when we present people to those extreme situations, we might be restricting ourselves to a point that it can lead to a possible underestimation. And both of these things will not be revealed until we enrich the variety of experimental paradigms that we are using with ones that more closely resemble the way we actually interact with our environment in everyday life. So we use psychophysical manipulations to manipulate consciousness and sort of compare what patterns appear and what we can or can't do with versus without awareness. These clever manipulations push us to certain limits that don't really resonate with real life situations. They might lead to both over and underestimating what we find about brain activity and various processes related to conscious versus unconscious processes. And this is why we think it's very important to consider the ecological validity of the manipulations, of the stimuli, of the measures when we perform experiments in consciousness science. So the term ecological validity commonly refers to the ability to generalize from what we observe in the lab to what we naturally observe outside the lab in everyday life. And even though this issue has been widely discussed in other fields, it has been mostly ignored by many studies in consciousness research, especially those that focus on the techniques we have mentioned before that are so common in the field. And to show the impact of transitioning into more ecologically valid designs, we can look at these other fields that already started to shift. And in other domains of neuroscience, increasing the ecological validity led to things like challenging what was previously found with the more classical methods, finding stronger effects than the ones that they found with the less ecological variation, and sometimes also inspiring to ask new questions and open up more possibilities than the ones that existed before. So now I'm going to give a few examples of these cases, but the overall arc of these examples is that this is what we expect to happen in consciousness research as well. So an example for challenging previous findings is for this study by Hirschhorn and colleagues, which is about face perception. So traditionally in face perception, people studied having participants observe images of faces that usually look like this. And a couple of things to note about these faces is that these stimuli are designed to have no color, eliminate shape and hairstyle as much as possible. And obviously, they are floating heads with no body, which is very different from the way that we see faces outside the lab. And what is typically found in EEG experiments presenting participants with face stimuli is an event-related potential called the N170. So it's a component that peaks approximately 170 milliseconds after a face is presented to the observer, stemming from occipital-temporal brain areas. And this component is typically stronger, meaning more negative, when a face is presented compared to other objects and perceptual controls. And that's why the N170 is traditionally considered to discriminate between faces and other things. And what Hirschhorn and colleagues did was to take images of people with body and color and hair and everything we normally see when we see another person on neutral backgrounds as stimuli. And they presented them both on computer screens and in a virtual reality environment. And in both of these conditions, participants saw images that contained the faces, as well as images where the person was scrambled or blurred, as shown here, as controls, much like the classical designs. And EEG was recorded, and then the researchers basically asked if indeed this N170 component would still be unique to trials where the person was intact versus the perceptual controls. And what they found was that, first of all, there was a difference in the general amplitude of the N170 between the two-dimensional presentation on the computer screen shown in blue and being presented in an immersive 360 VR environment shown in red, which is more negative overall. And in addition to having a larger overall amplitude, when in VR, there was no significant differences in the N170 amplitude between the conditions. Even in the computerized version, while there was a difference between the blurred version and the other versions, the N170 was not found to be different for faces versus the scrambled control, which, like I've shown before, is the classical perceptual control for this type of effect. So actually, when they looked later in time, they found that in the VR condition only, there is another component that differentiated between faces, which is the continuous red line, and the perceptual control, which are the red dashed lines. So this is just one example of how transitioning into more realistic stimuli challenged previous findings in the domain of face perception. Another reason a research field can benefit from increased ecological validity is that sometimes it can actually lead to stronger effects. And the example I'm going to use here is from memory research, specifically episodic memory. So usually in study of episodic memory, participants are presented with two-dimensional images of the objects and not with the objects themselves. But objects and pictures differ from one another in things like depth and having true size and distance and affording actions such as grasping and manipulation. So the question is whether what we know about episodic memory of objects from using 2D pictures holds for real-life objects. And what Snow and colleagues did in this study was to present participants with two objects at a time. They stood within reaching distance of the items, and they could either be real objects, colored photographs of those objects, or black and white drawings of the objects. And they looked at the display for 5 seconds at a time in a sequence of trials. Then, after the sequence of all objects, participants had both a recall task, where they had to list all the objects that they could remember, and a recognition task, where they were presented with a list of objects and had to say whether they appeared or not. And what you can see is that real objects, here in blue, were recalled more, with fewer mistakes, and also recognized better. This study, of course, contains more analyses and more experiments, but overall, what they found was that real objects are more memorable than images of those objects. So this is an example of a stronger result when transitioning into more realistic experiments here in the case of memory research. And in addition to strengthening or challenging previous results, increasing the ecological validity of experimental paradigms might help researchers ask new questions that resonate better with everyday life. And the example of that comes from the domain of free will. So there is a long ongoing debate about having free will, right? About us being the cause of our actions based on our intentions to do one thing or another. And experiments in this line of research all are highly affected by this seminal work by Benjamin Libet in the 1980s, where he timed people's decision to make a voluntary movement. So people were seated in front of a computer where a dot was moving in circles, and whenever they felt like moving their hand, they could. And then they were asked to indicate where was the dot on the screen when they felt the urge to move. And this is how they could trace the time when participants consciously decided to perform the action. And what he famously showed is that there is this buildup of EEG activity starting several hundred milliseconds before participants reporting having the urge to move. And this is called the readiness potential, and it sparked a whole discussion about the existence of free will, which was examined basically based on derivatives of this paradigm. But the problem is, how much can we really understand free will from questions about the urge to move your hand when sitting and staring at a dot going in circles? Instead, if we ask questions that resonate better with the decision we make in everyday life, we might uncover a different picture. And this is what Uli Maoz and colleagues did. They distinguished between deliberate decisions, decisions that are purposeful, that bear consequences, from arbitrary decisions, like the one in the Libet experiment of deciding to move your arm whenever. Other experiments in this field also focused on moving your hand or flexing your wrist and not on non-arbitrary decisions. But note that even this as an arbitrary decision about randomly moving a body organ is a decision we hardly make arbitrarily. So in this experiment, they asked people to make both deliberate and arbitrary decisions, where in the deliberate block, they had to decide which nonprofit organization they would donate $1,000 to. And in the arbitrary block, the organization both received the same amount of money, regardless of what the participants actually chose. And the participants knew this. And also, at the end of the experiment, the researchers actually donated money in the participants' name to the nonprofits based on their choices. And what they found was that while the readiness potential, this negative accumulation from about half a second before participants made the decision and chose the nonprofit, it's evident for the arbitrary decisions in blue, but you do not see it for the deliberate ones in red. And this is also the case at the level of single participants, as seen by the couple of examples here. And of course, they have shown that this is not driven by a difference in reaction times, different conditions, and other validations as well. So the important take-home message here is that when we ask about the existence of free will, we are not thinking only about meaningless, arbitrary decisions. The deliberate ones, the ones that carry actual consequences, are interesting to us with that respect. And incorporating those into research allow the experimenters to ask new questions and find interesting results. So now, after we have a few examples from other fields of why increasing ecological validity matters, we call for doing the same in manipulations of consciousness. And to provide researchers with a starting point, we identify 3 ways to increase ecological validity. It can be done by changing the stimuli, by changing the measures, and the questions that we're asking. And to each, I'm going to present an example from a study in our field to demonstrate what it can look like. In the paper itself, you can find numerous examples for each of the points that we are making here. But as we are limited in time, I'm going to present mainly examples from our group, as these are also the ones that I know better. So we will start with the stimuli. I like this example because even if we still choose to use continuous flash suppression, which is the highly unrealistic paradigm as we discussed before, we can still do it using more realistic stimuli and find interesting results. So you don't have to completely go outside the lab and stop using existing techniques to increase the ecological validity of your research. This is not the claim that we're making here. Even within the boundaries of existing paradigms, changing, for example, the stimuli can still bring us closer to understanding everyday experiences. So what we have here is from Uli Koriski of continuous flash suppression using real-life objects. And the way it was done is with this somewhat kooky setup where the participant is wearing augmented reality goggles. In one eye, they're presented with the same dynamic flashing pattern usually shown in this sort of study, but the other eye is completely unmasked and exposed to the world. And after the masking starts in that eye, you can expose the subject with real objects and they will not see them. So she didn't see the ducky, she didn't see the hand, and she also doesn't see Uli's face. We did this both with real objects and with colored photographs of those objects. And overall, what we found is that you can suppress real life three-dimensional objects using this technique. So now this opens up an opportunity to re-examine everything we know about processing objects without awareness from studies that were using traditional CFS on a computer screen. Another example comes from a different type of manipulation called inattentional blindness. So maybe the most famous inattentional blindness experiment is the one of the gorilla, where the observers watched a video of a group passing a ball and had to count how many passes they made. This is an attention-grabbing task where you really need to be on the ball at all times. And at some point, a woman dressed in a gorilla costume enters the frame, stands there, taps her chest, and leaves. And the striking result is when asked about this event in a series of questions shown here on the right, about 40% of the participants failed to notice the gorilla. Of course, once you're asked about it, the gorilla is now expected and you will not miss it again. Regardless of how much we agree or disagree on whether manipulating attention like that actually manipulates consciousness such that the observers really don't see the critical stimulus, inattentional blindness has been in use in studies trying to understand unconscious processing and the neural correlates of consciousness. But as we discussed before, there might be a difference between what we are aware and unaware of when interacting with our environment and what we are aware and unaware of when we are watching some stimulus as external observers or when we're viewing very simplified displays on the screen, especially if these displays are presented in the scales of milliseconds. So what we did was to create a virtual environment where we can control what the participants see and when, and have the attention-grabbing task there. So the task was to follow a single bee in a cluster of bees while the participants was riding along down a busy street. And at the end of each trial, they had to select the target bee, and they were playing for money. They gained money, real money if they succeeded, and lost money if they were wrong. But crucially, on the bus stops on each side of the road, sometimes an image appeared. And after selecting the bee, observers were asked both subjective and objective questions about the experience of that target image that was presented on the bus stop. And this allowed us to not only demonstrate that people report not seeing the critical stimulus, it actually happened again and again, more than once, despite here at the bottom looking directly at it for several seconds at a time. So this provides the opportunity, again, to examine inattentional blindness in neuroscientific experiments while having observers interact with a complex dynamic environment instead of watching a simplified screen. And this can be done with EEG in virtual reality, with previewing and movement, thanks to incredible works such as labs of Peter Koenig, for example, where they combine EEG with eye tracking data in virtual reality to identify event-related potentials that are tied to natural fixation onsets. And this allows then researchers to come up with more ecologically valid setups and still be able to measure neural activity and extract meaningful data. Another way of getting existing manipulations closer to everyday life is by making the measures more ecologically valid. Our natural behaviors such as eye movements and respiration, heart rate, motion, they can reveal a lot of information about what we process. And they might be different from what we collect when asking participants to make specific button presses. So an example of that is collecting motor trajectories using the masking manipulation we discussed before. So in this experiment, participants had to categorize the target stimulus that appeared consciously as an animal or a person. And the prime, the masked stimulus, was either congruent with the target category or, like we see here, inconsistent with the target. And in this type of experiments, evidence for priming, for the masked stimulus affecting the judgment of the target stimulus, is demonstrated by a difference in reaction times, by the time it takes the participant to press the keyboard key associated with the correct answer. But like we mentioned before, we are very much used to reaching and touching things, and not only to making selections on a keyboard. And what the researchers did in this experiment is that instead of pressing a button to indicate whether the target was an animal or a person, the observers had to reach and touch the location on the screen corresponding with their choice. And then they collected not only the response and the time it took, but actually the entire motion trajectory participants made on their way to the location of choice. And what you see when looking at these trajectories is that observers' initial motion is governed by the masked stimulus. And this is most evident if you look at panel B, where the prime and target don't match. And you see the larger offset, the larger miss that happened at the initial stage of the reaction, then correcting towards the end. So this is another example of a case where even if choosing to continue with a classic psychophysical manipulation, such as masking, taking different measures might help categorize effects unconscious stimuli have on everyday behaviors and the stages where those effects kick in. Lastly, we can increase ecological validity of experiments and bring them closer to everyday instances of conscious and unconscious processes by increasing the ecological validity of the questions that we're asking. And actually, the demonstration here will not refer to a new question, but to a 30-year-old one, stemming from the famous distinction made by the philosopher Ned Block between what he called phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness. So phenomenal consciousness refers to the purely subjective aspect of conscious experience. This is sometimes also referred to as the what's it like or qualia. And access consciousness talks about the cognitive access one has to that experience, the ability to perform mental operations on it, to report it, and so on. Most of the time, it makes sense that these two come together. However, there have been claims that they can come apart, such that you can have a conscious experience of something without having any access to that experience. And the example that Block uses for a possible case where phenomenology might come without access is the one of the fridge. So think about a time when suddenly the compressor in your fridge went off. You're aware now that the hum that the refrigerator made up until that point stopped, but what can you say about hearing it until then? And the point is that only after the hum stopped, you realize you heard it all along. And you might be even able to know exactly what it sounded like before it went off. So this is sort of a case of an everyday experience where you can arguably have phenomenal experience without access. Of course, the difficulty here will be to distinguish between phenomenology without access versus having neither, right? Just being unaware. You might have been completely unconscious of the noise when it was on, and this abrupt stop was actually sort of like a retroactive cue, making you aware of something you were previously unconscious of. So Yoni Amir took up the challenge of translating this everyday experience into a manipulation that can be studied in the lab. So the study was an auditory one, where the hum of the refrigerator is what we see here as the pink noise. And the main task in this experiment, participants were presented with two sounds and had to indicate whether they heard a specific sound. Do you hear cats? Do you hear sheep? They're also asked, do you hear something? Which is supposed to be yes, as long as those sounds are on. And crucially, in 2/3 of the trials, there was another sound, that pink noise, in the background as well. And then the main sounds were turned off, with the pink noise being the only one remaining in the trials where it was introduced. And then participants were asked if they hear something. And after that, the pink noise was turned off, and participants were asked if they heard a change. And regardless of what they answered, then they had a discrimination task and had to choose which was the pink noise that was introduced in that trial. So given the trials where the pink noise was introduced, the question is, did the participants report hearing the pink noise when it was on, and did they report the change when it went off? So an access trial would be a trial where they said they heard something when the only thing on was the pink noise, and also heard the change when it was turned off. A non-conscious trial would be trials where they denied hearing the noise and also denied noticing when it went off. And a phenomenal trial, if there is one, would be trials where they denied hearing the noise, but noticed the change when it went off. And what they found was, not only did participants have those types of trials, but when looking at their performance in the discrimination task of choosing the pink noise, they are above chance level. They are better than guessing. Obviously, in access trials, their performance was high as they reported hearing the noise to begin with, but interestingly, their performance is higher than chance in the phenomenal trials in orange. Of course, maybe this can be, again, explained by unconscious processing. Maybe participants did not have any conscious experience of the pink noise, but some unconscious processing of it pushed them towards the correct answer. But participants also had the non-conscious trials, the trials where they denied hearing anything and did not hear when the pink noise went off. And you can see in gray that in those non-conscious trials, performance on the discrimination task is not different from chance. This is guessing. So thanks to the existence of non-conscious trials, unconscious processing can't really explain what's going on in those phenomenal trials, because if unconscious processing of the pink noise pushed participants toward the correct answer without having any experience of it, this should have been the case also for the non-conscious trials. So this is a very interesting example of approaching questions about the contents of consciousness inspired by everyday examples. I want to stress several points about the approach that we presented here so far. So the first point is that we present these three ways to increase the ecological validity of a manipulation, but this is not a hard framework of how we need to get closer to real life and consciousness manipulations. These are some methods that we identified and therefore suggest. You can use one of them, you can even combine them, you can come up with another way that we didn't mention here for increasing the relevance of your manipulation to real life instances of conscious and unconscious processes. So less of a framework and more like a buffet or a build your own salad sort of thing, where you can choose how much cucumber you want to put. So think about those parts of the experiment that can be made even a little more ecologically valid, resemble a bit better the actual phenomena that we're interested in, helps promote our understanding of consciousness in everyday life. Another important point is that this is not going against the classical, meticulous, existing materials and methods that have been in use in consciousness manipulation so far. What we do think is needed, especially because of the nature of the phenomena that we're talking about, is to complement these methods with ones that connect what we can find when we use them with what we find in everyday life outside the lab. And obviously, the more you introduce things that increase the ecological validity, there is a trade-off with the amount of experimental control your design has. But as we've shown here, added noise and complexity are not always a bad thing, and it can teach us something about conscious perception beyond these highly controlled designs. And it also has the potential to strengthen and generalize their results to real-life situations. The third point is that in no way we're saying that this move, whichever way chosen, is easy. Most of the ways to incorporate more ecologically valid materials and methods without giving up on experimental control and accuracy of measurement as much as we can are technically hard. And actually, even when using the simple, well-controlled, familiar methods and stimuli and techniques, there is still so much that needs to be accounted for and can go wrong. And in a recent work we put on PsycArXiv, led by Alex Dapov, we tried to standardize tests for classical experimental setups. And there we show just how much there is technically, even in the simplest of designs, to take care of. So obviously, generating more complex stimuli, adding measurement tools, coming up with more convoluted methods, all of that comes with a price of the difficulty to deploy it and run it in the lab. We do, however, think that this is worth it, that the field has a lot to gain from this transition. So to sum up, we showed that increasing ecological validity of experiments can challenge what we knew about a phenomenon. It can strengthen previously found effects. It can inspire new questions that resonate better with everyday phenomena. We demonstrated three ways that this can be done with our phenomenon of interest in consciousness research by changing the stimuli and the measures and the questions themselves. And despite the downsides and the difficulties, like how hard it is to make this transition and how it does require giving up on some levels of experimental control, this is important when we think about what we really want to know about conscious experience and unconscious processes. I thank you very much for listening. The full paper is online. I also want to thank my lab and MESEC. Thank you very much.